NetSparker, the developers of a comprehensive automated web security platform that includes web vulnerability scanning, assessment, and management. NetSparker's desktop and cloud-based security solutions employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities and provides a proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/NetSparker. Are you an enterprise dissatisfied with overpriced analytics software that can't keep up with modern data? If so, then GravWell is the solution for you. GravWell is an unstructured data analytics platform for enterprises who demand total data visibility across their network. GravWell lets your security team go beyond the SIM and fuse data sources to correlate and answer questions you didn't know needed to be asked. Go to gravwell.io/securityweekly for an unlimited data trial and gain uncompromising visibility today. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Quick announcement. Join us at InfoSec World 2020 virtually, June 22nd through the 24th. This is a fully virtual event, as I believe many of our events will be this year, at least thus far. Security Weekly listeners still save 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World's Pass by visiting securityweekly.com/ISW 2020. I'd like to welcome no stranger to the show, our friend Harry Sverdlov, Edgewise's Chief Technology Officer, who was previously the CTO of Carbon Black, and today works with at Edgewise in Zero Trust. But now, Harry, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me today.
So it's interesting, Harry. It's nice to have you back. And what I find is the more I think about the current situation that the world is in with this pandemic, and a lot of the things that we're talking about in regular circles and how those relate to, what we've largely labeled as zero trust and or microsegmentation, but more largely zero trust, really kind of underscores how misunderstood that term zero trust is. And I think when we talk about things like segmentation and quarantining and contact tracing and all these different terms, if I start to relate those down to, specifically Edgewise's product and what you've shown us so far to us and our listeners, there are some really interesting parallels.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was thinking about this before as well, as we're dealing with essentially a quarantine world where we're trying to figure out where our security issues are, what are essential services or essential workers, how do we do contact tracing, how do we restrict who can connect or communicate or contact whom. All of these principles already apply in concepts like zero trust, or as you say, microsegmentation, which is the idea of least privilege, the idea that you don't trust what you don't know. You don't trust anything, and then you assess trust and build trust based on the identities, or in the strangely real world case, people, but based on the identities of things that are communicating. And that kind of principle, that's the basis for everything we do at Edgewise. It's not coincidental. It's not surprising that the real world in epidemiology or in disease control or in any other facet, similar principles apply.
It's interesting when I think about essential versus non-essential, and then I put that in the context of our applications, let's say, right, in IT functions. And it's almost like your essential functions are oftentimes the most vulnerable because they have to be the most usable because they're the most essential. And that translates into this pandemic. If you're an essential worker, you may have to put yourself more at risk to be able to do your job.
Well, it's true in the real world because for essential workers, we don't have the ability to isolate people by identity. So let's just say you're an essential worker, you go to a grocery store, you don't have the ability to isolate people from contacting each other, even though obviously the grocery store needs to be populated, people need to be able to go there, get their food. But in a digital world, you actually do have that ability. You might have an Active Directory controller, you might have your email services, things that are essential services for your business to operate. And with software, unlike in the real world, you actually can restrict those essential services to only communicate with what they need to, even if everybody else is consuming parts of that service without exposing, your core essential services, if you will, to the same risk that might be there in the general population.
Yeah, you have more control in a software world to basically further segment at a more fine granular level rather than just, going to the store, right? Where you really don't have control over who you're interacting with.
No, and actually it's interesting, and not to beat a metaphor to death, but what we have the ability to do right now in the physical world is quarantine based on addresses, which is kind of the problem that Edgewise and we've always had with firewalls or traditional firewalls in the first place, which is you can quarantine a home, but there may be one essential worker in that home, or there may be one infected person in that home. And unfortunately, we don't have the ability to quarantine by room. We don't have the ability to quarantine actually by those people. So we'll quarantine a location, or we'll quarantine a street. And we hope that it's only then being used by essential workers, or it's only being, in the case of quarantine the sick, it's only being used by infected people. In the digital world, you actually do have that ability. You can have 17 services running in the same on the same host, and you can restrict their ability to communicate as if they were completely on different networks, on different segments, on different machines. And it's something that we can't yet do in the physical world, but we have a lot more flexibility and power, which allows us to do the types of things of securing essential services in a manner that really we would love to do in the real world, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I also find it interesting that, one of the things that's happening as a result of all of this is that many organizations are taking their services and or data, both, and maybe it's accessible now through people's home networks, and there's a big movement to now take your services and data and put that in the cloud. And if there was ever a time to call for protecting your applications and data when it's somewhere else that is outside of your tightly controlled borders, or maybe not so tightly controlled borders, it is now, right? We've seen this huge shift into the cloud. And I think really it's the opportunity to understand that you need to protect your application no matter where it's running. Could be in a hostile environment.
Absolutely. And in fact, you can't quarantine the cloud. The virtual world. It's another problem we have in the virtual world. Is this lag that we're dealing with in the physical reflection? But you can't quarantine an entire cloud, and this is why it's as we're all now working, so many of us are working from home and have the ability to access, and companies are moving their critical services to online access. They're actually basically intentionally expanding their perimeter to include everybody's household, to include all of their employees and their homes where their kids are playing or downloading MP3s or doing whatever it is that people will do on those same networks that are now essentially connected to their critical services. So now more than ever, there's no question that identifying what is your critical services and only allowing what you need to communicate is more important than ever.
Well, I had a question. So, as you know, I work in the .gov space, and often we get into conversations about trusted internet connections. And I was looking at the latest presentation on that and thinking about talking to you this afternoon. We have talked about, traditional, endpoint connections across the network or even into the cloud where, we're talking IaaS and possibly PaaS. But what about when you get up to the SaaS layer, in particular, so you're talking about a ServiceNow, a Salesforce, or whatever. Do you have an answer there?
I'm sorry, you kind of broke up on that. Can you repeat that question?
Oh, I apologize. I need to insert another quarter for 3 more minutes here. So basically, as we were looking at the different layers of cloud services, we've talked about, protecting IaaS and PaaS with you before. But what if we jump up to the SaaS layer? I mean, how can you help me there? Or can you?
Where you're actually connecting to other services. If you're the way that an identity-based segmentation solution works is if you're dealing with managed connections or even partially managed connections. So in the case of a home access, a computer, an iPad, something that you can manage, then we can ascertain the true identity of the software communicating. So that your SSH or your dial-up program or your VPN software, only that software is allowed to use your trusted connections. No other software on that system. Now, obviously, the full security comes when you can manage both sides. So that on the other side, if in the cloud you have a hosted server or hosted service that you can install Edgewise software on, then we can properly fingerprint, the cryptographic fingerprint of both pieces of software. And then you have even a fully managed secure connection. If you're connecting to services outside of your managed scope, so Google Docs or something like that, then at least you can secure one half of the equation. But to secure the pure SaaS side, where you're not running your own systems, there are systems running elsewhere, and you're only using their services, that's where you might go into something like a CASB or other solutions that would secure access to that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I was wondering
sorry,
how far
Joe, follow up. Go ahead.
I was wondering how far it could go. It's had some really cool talks before about capabilities and stuff. It's just, and CASB is a good answer.
And you know, one of the
and it really does get down to. Go ahead.
Sorry, there's a little lag there. Go ahead.
The visual cues on lag. This is, it's funny when you started the segment and you were talking about the virtual world versus the real world. In this world we're living in now, and we're all online doing Zoom meetings, and we're kind of moving into the virtual world, but not in the cool, sexy way I thought we would. Like when I watched Lawnmower Man years ago, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. We're kind of moving in this, and I don't think the hardware is quite yet ready for the physical world to move virtual yet.
It's so true. It's interesting that we talk about contact tracing, right? And it was something in the physical world I think we weren't really prepared for, to, have this running list of who we interacted with. When we protect software and applications, though, that I think that's a much easier task to accomplish, to figure out who did I talk with if there was an incident, correct?
No question about it. If you think about what's the first thing that incident response teams do when they go in and they perform a forensic analysis after a breach. Now they're doing this post-mortem, but they literally are sitting there pulling a thread, trying to figure out, okay, we have a system that was compromised. What software was on it? Who did it communicate with? What users did they communicate with? What other systems did it jump to? And they literally spend the time sifting through firewall logs, access logs, system logs to do retrospective contact tracing. With Edgewise and with systems that we can do today now with technology, you have that real time. We know every system, every service, every process, every application, who it's communicated with, how long it's communicated, who else has communicated, and analyzing that chain in real time. That's in fact how you achieve proper microsegmentation, is understanding what communicates. But even just from a visibility perspective, that gives you real-time contact tracing. So you can tell exactly if there is something, it's easier to visualize with a compromised system or a compromised service. If you know that there's something malicious, let's say you don't have any restrictions in place, but you can immediately trace everything that it contacted, what other software, what did it contact, so forth and so on. It's a powerful investigative tool. It's also obviously a powerful tool for proactive protection as well.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting, as we talk about things like Zoom, which I still think we're talking about, right? They just released a new version. We want our applications to be secure, a missed change, right? And I think the thing that caught us off guard with, not just to pick on Zoom, but any other application, was we never really thought about, well, what if everyone were to use this virtual conferencing software? What protections would we want to have in place? I think it's interesting that many of us never asked those questions about basically who the software should interact with, who the software should allow to interact with it once a call was set up. Obviously, it was a really big issue, right? And I really think that speaks to the trust between your users and software, and and the applications, and very much relates to the zero trust model.
I've heard that sentiment on numerous occasions in similar ways, Paul. Every time I hear it, I keep thinking, yeah, kind of like the internet.
It's very true, Jeff. No, it is. Yeah.
That's it.
It's kind of like everything. In fact, that's the challenge with security, it's a challenge with security in general. And again, not to pick on Zoom, but Zoom came along pre all of this, and the idea was, hey, great, we can get people to meet virtually and talk together. But when it started as an enabling technology. It didn't start with there wasn't somebody, well, I assume, on the team with an offensive mindset saying, wait a second, what if I want to misuse Zoom? What if I want to abuse it? It's the same thing as you said with the internet or with email or with anything else. If there's a way to abuse it, once it becomes popular, it will be abused.
It's interesting. All of the Zoom bombing you could almost relate to like the Morris worm, right? We were all very too trusting in each case of the technology.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's better. Yeah, I love zero trust as a principle, and I think it's the right approach, obviously, for the virtual or for the computing world. It's a shame if the real world has to become that way, but unfortunately, not everybody is necessarily good as we'd like to believe so. And not to get onto a whole Locke and Hobbes kind of philosophy, but unfortunately, where there is room for malicious, there will be people using that.
Harry, are there some use cases that you have where folks are using Edgewise's zero trust capability on the endpoints? Right, we've talked a lot about protecting the applications and on the server side. What are some of the use cases on the endpoint, especially now, as the endpoint could be maybe someone's home PC, right, or home computer or laptop or tablet, versus something that has more tighter controls that lives inside of the enterprise facilities?
Right. Well, the most common use case, and this was even pre work at home, the everybody work at home world, which was the situation of customers having their own data centers, having their own cloud computing environments, and their engineers either working from home or in their work network wanted to access that data center, especially developers, so they have high privileged access to critical infrastructure and or to the software that they're developing in their data centers. And so that's sort of your first instance, even though you might have two managed networks, one that's your cloud network, on-prem or off, and one that is your on-prem or office network, where engineers needed to be able to securely remotely access their data center, but wanted to do so in a much more secure manner than just a VPN, where other software on their system might be able to share that connection. That same model applies as you take those engineers or you take those knowledge workers and you bring them home. And now they just happen to be working from home, dialed up on Xfinity, but it's the same problem. They have a connection. They need a secure connection to a set of assets, in this case, a data center or any other. It might be even your corporate network that they now need to access, but they need to do so in a secure manner. They can't let anybody flood through that line. They need to only have, if you want security, only your authorized software communicating. And when they do get onto the other side, the same thing applies once you're inside any managed network. So obviously it applies from an east-west perspective as much as it does from north-south.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about in the context of tightly controlled software. In other words, especially in this time, if you're a developer and you have access to code commits for things like core Cisco networking, I mean, not to pick on Cisco, right, but very popular Cisco networking gear, and Huawei had very similar kind of examples about just how tightly controlled it was in order for someone to be able to check code in that will essentially end up in firmware for potentially millions of devices across the world. It sounds like some of those same techniques now we can apply zero trust to and take the benefits from that when users are working from endpoints, working from home today.
Absolutely. And again, it all boils down to that principle of don't trust, establish trust. So zero trust is you start with zero trust. You have to establish that trust, and the trust can't just be based on, because you were communicating from a good address to a bad address. When you're working from home, everything at home is an untrusted address. In fact, even if you're in the office, you take that same principle where you say anything you're doing or where you're doing it from by definition should be untrusted. Then let's take a look at what user is actually running that process. Mm-hmm. What is that software? Is it the authorized VPN software, upload software, source control, revision control software? Right. And who is it communicating to? Is it communicating with what it should be?
Yeah, I like that example because is it the Git client that I'm using, or is it some variation or something else running inside of my Git process? Because if I want access to that source code, I mean, we all know nation states in this particular case are going to be after that source code, right? So I imagine these protections existed in those environments. More questions for Harry from the group alone.
And we all know there's no such thing as a compromised GitHub client. Never happened.
Right. We wonder how things like digital certificates go missing and get out in the wild and are used by various nation-state groups, our own included, sometimes, in some cases.
Unfortunately.
Yes. More questions for Harry on the concept of zero trust as we kind of relate it to what we're going through today.
Yeah, I had an idea. I'm not sure if I'm in the related category, but I'm wondering where's your next big challenge, Harry? I mean, we talked about all kinds of cool stuff, but maybe that's giving away too much of your secrets. I don't mean to go there. I just thought, what's an interesting challenge you're looking at?
Good question.
Right. Well, I think you touched on one of the interesting challenges, which is right now the zero trust technology, and at Edgewise, we're able to fully map out communications and secure, understand clusters, understand communications and secure them essentially in a single click. But that's most effective for managed clients. So one of the challenges that we're working on, and in fact, developing technology to deal with, is those situations, both absolutely and metaphorically akin to that SaaS description you were talking about, where you have Fargate or you have Lambda functions or you have other services that you rely on, but they're not managed clients. And you want to be able to secure those communications in exactly the same way. So that's one of the interesting areas that we are currently developing. And that's part of broadening out this idea of continuing to bring identity-based segmentation, identity-based security to all aspects of your computing environment. I think the other aspect, and it does relate a lot to the work from home, but even more so, which is tying in the technology of east-west security. As I mentioned, one of our primary use cases is developers and other high authorized users having access into data centers and elsewhere, but certainly it's also within the data center. And our focus, and a large part of our focus, is on east-west traffic security. But tying that into north-south, eventually I think the compass is going to break, and there's the distinctions between north, south, east, west are going to become more and more muddy. And so making sure that technology platform, that enabling platform, is seamless, regardless of whether you're north, you're south, you're east, you're west, or add a Z-axis in there, maybe you're somewhere else.
Yeah,
so Harry, you touched on something that really resonates, right? And one of the, I think, not just my struggles, but everyone's struggle as we push into the cloud is, how do I get a handle on all these various cloud components and what trust level that they have with each other, right? Because what I think ends up happening more often than not is, we kind of have this misconception that we're going to deploy up into the cloud and everything's going to be great and it's all going to be cloud services, right? But in actuality, what you end up with is code and some services that belong to me and my organization, and some other code and services that belong to people like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. And how do all of those interact, with each other, respectively? And how do we control the zero trust model in that cloud environment?
And that's one of the, that actual principle is one of the things that we started Edgewise on, which is the assumption that a lot of the new or breakout technologies in security come from new libraries or new developments, where if you're building a brand new language or a brand new application using X, Y, or Z widgets, it will be more secure. But the reality is that you're going to be depending on another X, Y, and Z set of widgets from other people, from third parties. And so one of the principles we base the Edgewise technology on is you don't necessarily have access to your source code. You can't redevelop, recompile, redeploy all your software. How do you overlay or underlay, as it were, security in a model where you don't necessarily own, control, compile, deploy half of the components, right, or more, that are part of your infrastructure? It's an important part, and you can't, you just can't forklift everything. Even in the most modern computing environments, there's a heck of a lot of network traffic in the base components that are going to old legacy systems, to legacy infrastructure that you don't have control over in the same way. And so you need to be able to build security on top of that, even if you don't have access to those components.
Right. And not just make firewall rule, air quotes, firewall rules between them, like you pointed out before.
Right.
Do you see...
Tyler,
that's not going to give you that.
Yeah, I was curious, do you see with all this remote work from home, that kind of same principle apply to the bring your own technology or bring your own device that a lot of people are having to deploy, say from a standpoint of they need to provide a computer to work from home. Corporate assets aren't being provided, or the company doesn't have enough assets to kick out. Do you see some of the same protections working across those kind of disconjoined devices?
Yeah, I think it's a perfect fit for that BYOD environment where people are bringing in their own devices, their own platform, if you will, or environment, but the software that they need to run that's part of the business critical applications or just part of your job, that isn't BYOS. You're not bringing your own software, although on that BYOD device, you've got Candy Crush and you've got 10 other things or 10,000 other things that are not corporate. And so the ability, you can't just secure the device because these are not your devices. They're somebody else's. But can you secure the software that you need them to run on those devices? Absolutely. And that fits square within the zero trust model, where you're looking at identity, not just of devices. That's part of what represents identity, but more importantly, the identity of the process of the software that's actually doing the communication. I think that's critical, especially since most end users are now using their devices to do a lot more than just work.
So does that also apply to that kind of bring your own device where SaaS or single sign-on applies? Like you need to protect a particular piece of application that maybe has multiple uses, like a browser, right? You're going to end up in a zero trust model for a particular application, but what if that application has multiple uses where they're signing into their work email or single sign-on adding extensions, and then you have Candy Crush being played in there? Does that also apply to those particular applications and how that security zero trust model works?
Great question, Tyler.
Yeah, I think it does, and I think you're right that it does create some technical challenges. One of the nice things, just on that side note about browsers, is as browser isolation has gotten, has basically become the norm, so that your separate tabs actually are running in separate processes, and they have separate identities that can be associated with other information on the page, other information about the user session. You can securely identify tab A as this is the tab running single sign-on, this is Harry, I know it is, blah, 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 he's been two-factor auth, versus this other tab, this is running personal Harry, and he's on Facebook and he's playing Candy Crush. So the platform, in this case, the browser, actually does help to be modeled that way, but it does, you're right, it does require, when you're dealing with multi-use software, multi-purpose, multi-use concurrent software, to be able to, if you will, up the game as to what is identity. So it's not just, okay, it's a browser. That's not good enough. Who's the user signed into that? What's the SSO information that's tied to that? What's the website or the address that's part of that identity? And so as we start having, browser is one great example, but there are other examples as well where it now becomes more important to sort of up your game as to what is identity.
Yeah, you got to protect your application within the application, right? And you either got to somehow hook the browser or have some kind of add-on to the browser, which each have their pros and cons to be able to protect your application within that application, which is interesting.
Does that
Exactly.
does some of that single sign-on and OAuth kind of identity management and application protection, does some of that have the ability to do like anomalous detection and provide some value in maybe a different quadrant that maybe we're not thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea. One of the things that we've learned just on the data that we are able to monitor is when you start monitoring communications, not by addresses and such, but actually by identities, you can actually detect anomalous behaviors or signatures. And we're not in the business today, Edgewise, of developing anomaly signatures, but we have this rich data that allows us to create signatures and observations based on identity that are rather powerful, if you will. Does an application communicate with multiple different applications, even if it's using the same channel? Does it communicate with the same application, but over multiple different channels? And you're able to start building signature behaviors as to what might tell us is something suspicious going on. And when you couple that in with an OAuth or an SSO or other identity information, hey, I've got information from my OAuth that this user's authenticated, but they're also currently authenticated in Guam and, in Taiwan and in Africa right now. That type of telemetry all of that is really going to be a powerful tool. And again, it gets back to what you're tracking as part of identity, the user, the process, the device. But you're tracking these things, and you're able to start developing patterns that will allow us in the future to be much more robust about applying zero trust principles, because it's not just establishing trust, it's also revoking trust. As to when do you want to revoke trust? If it turns out that you are actually have some suspicious activity going on, maybe we restrict the access to certain assets, but not to others. You can still use your VPN channel. You can still dial in, but maybe you don't get access to your source control system. Or maybe you don't get access to certain sensitive documents, sort of like government classifications and secret level classifications. You adjust it, but not just based on absolute terms, but based on what's happening and the telemetry you might receive from an OAuth system, a telemetry you might receive as well from other technologies that are monitoring device anomalies, device behaviors, as well as identity behaviors, and in our case, software behaviors.
This is just a fascinating discussion, because it's got me thinking. We started with trying to trust different networks and IP addresses, right? And then now the discussion is going into, do I trust the device, regardless of what IP address it has? Do I trust the user, which is a completely separate identity, and do I trust the application? And then, Harry, what you're alluding to is basically how to correlate those things together to say, well, what should a user who's using this device on this application, what should they have access to based on the correlation of all that data? That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting, because it's one of the talks I used to give a couple of years back, which is what is trust? And it absolutely is the combination of all of those things. If you take any one of those out of the equation, you have a trusted device, trusted software, but an untrusted user.
Right.
Or you have a trusted user, trusted software, and an untrusted device. The trust model breaks down completely if you don't take that into account. And taking that into account doesn't necessarily mean it's a binary, you have access, you don't have access. It could be a restricting of movement,
yep,
or it could be a throttling of the amount of things you can do. But trust is absolutely a combination of all of those factors.
Mm.
Yeah, what I think is interesting, if you don't mind me jumping in here, Paul,
yeah,
it is that, I grew up, and I know Paul did too, in large network world, and one of the things we struggled with for years was, how do we map that physical, not physical, really the layer 3 stuff? How do we map our subnet allocations over to the applications and the users? And we never had that connection without going through some sort of manual machinations and a lot of pain, frankly. And whether it was client-facing networks, whether it was server-facing networks, it was the same thing ultimately. And so what we all wished for historically was to bring together the trust component from user, application, network all into one piece. And it's been something that a lot of people have tried to solve over time, and it's a really important equation, because network addresses don't mean squat in the end, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, Joff, in the university setting, right? We take the students who are on their own subnets and networks, and largely we're like, well, we shouldn't trust those. But that quickly falls down if we use that environment as an example, because
exactly, right.
If it's a valid user and they're using a valid application and they're doing research and they need to access an internal, research facility within the university, then that should be trusted. And how do we differentiate that from either an evil user and or evil application or some combination thereof? And should that have access to that research unit within the organization? And you're spot on. Yeah.
And that's exactly right. And historically, the old model of kind of making manual adjustments for that, that doesn't scale today.
Yeah, we were like, filtering ports and blocking IP address, right? It was a game of whack-a-mole. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a game of whack-a-mole, and the end user community was always irritated with that model.
Yes.
And so the important thing is to have software that controlling that policy level control plane, so that we don't play that game of whack-a-mole, and that we do this intelligently. And that's everything that you're talking about. It really is a critical part of the equation. And now, of course, we're scaling that up into microflows for applications, to have a network that intelligently adapts to specific applications and users coupled together is really the ultimate goal.
And,
Right.
and it's funny, Harry, you know, we talk about, you know, networks and firewalls in the traditional sense. When I worked at the university, there was a very astute and extremely intelligent person who was poking holes in my firewall strategy. And I was like, look, this is all we have right now, right? And that person turned out to be one of the leads for the Shibboleth project, right? Who 20 years
right.
ago was like, this whole network, you know, trust thing is really bad. And if you were listening to this conversation today, you know, he'd be going like a huge "I told you so" Paul moment. Like, you finally came around to what I was saying 20 years ago. So he was 20 years ahead of the curve.
But what I like.
Well, and not only was
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Harry.
I was going to say. Yeah, not only was he ahead of the curve in terms of that, but the thing that wasn't the case back then in the university days is now with virtualization, with elasticity, with scaling, that network that you're having your students access because of a load, because of a downtime, might literally just be moved to another continent, literally.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, all the IP addresses change. So the addresses that you were sitting there playing whack-a-mole on, not only were they almost, you were sort of fighting a reflection, you were trying to chase your shadow. Now the sun is moving before you even know it. And so all of a sudden you can't rely at all on those addresses. The Zoom meeting right now, you know, I noticed I'm having a little bit of lag here. If we switch Zoom servers, it's going to be a whole different set of IP addresses.
It's true. So
we could secure this channel, and then all of a sudden we bounce over to a higher capacity server, and all of a sudden we've done nothing.
And that person was Steve Carmody, by the way, who's just an awesome individual. And I wish I had realized how much knowledge and wisdom he was instilling upon me 20 years ago. Yeah.
You know, I mean, and really,
knowledge is wasted on the youth.
Right. Exactly. So true.
What we've come around to is that it's really important to have that automation to drive the control plane of those security policies for the network transport, because network transport doesn't need a manual intervention in the way, frankly. It needs to have some intelligent automation. Now, what we've got to be careful of always is that we don't hack the control plane, because if we hack the control plane, if we hijack the control plane, then we take over that policy control, and that is in my world today. I think the control plane security, when you go soup to nuts, cloud to enterprise and beyond, is basically everything, right? If you actually compromise that control plane, then you've got serious problems.
It's interesting that I'm a
big believer, and I think this is where we need to go.
Sorry, there is a little bit of lag. Sorry, Harry, and then Tyler.
Lag, I apologize. Okay, so what I was going to say is I'm a big believer in moving that control plane as close as possible to the actual things communicating. When you have a control plane that's, for example, a physical firewall, or you have a control plane that's a cloud service somewhere else, that's a single point of failure. If you hack that control plane, you can damage the entire network. If the control plane and the decisions are being made locally, they're being made by the process trying to communicate. It's such that if that control plane is hacked, that identity changes, in fact, or the identity of the device or the identity of the software. That provides a much more secure environment. So I'm a big believer in pushing the control plane down to where the decisions are made and dispersing that control plane, because that becomes a much harder, that's something that cannot be singularly hacked.
That's a great point, Tyler.
I think a lot of what we're talking about too is similar to the problem that we've been trying to solve, that kind of MFA or two-factor has come into play, where we're eliminating the trust of a password, we're eliminating the trust of a host or a name or a username. It's one more piece to this puzzle of not relying on the things that at the end of the day are breached, are constantly disclosed, are forgotten, are poorly chosen by the user, and we're really taking that control to the people and the places that matter, and figuring out a way to kind of integrate all of those pieces together and really build a seamless kind of all-encompassing holistic view of what is identifying and what is trusted from a zero trust model. I think it's a huge push in the right direction.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, Tyler, because when we look at the history of passwords, it was more so to separate the data between users than it really was to validate that that user was who they said they were, right? And there's a huge difference between that. And it really wasn't until recently that I, came to understood the roots of why we started implementing passwords and how we're trying to use them today. It makes total sense why we would turn to multi-factor authentication to add another layer to say, well, I just don't want to separate, users and make sure they can access this data. I want to try and validate the user is who they say they are. And even multi-factor authentication doesn't quite cut it.
No, and we had certs back in the day. We had PGP. We've got hardware tokens. We've got all of these different kind of better technologies, but none of them, again, are starting with that kind of zero trust. And really, from an end user standpoint, they're either very hard to deploy or they're very confusing for end users, and thus they're not going to be used. Yep. So we really have to kind of figure that out. And everybody keeps going back to this biometrics, but again, you're taking something that can't be changed, and that's a really freaking bad idea.
Right.
And you're digitizing it, and what happens when that database gets leaked? And my biometrics are forever gone.
But,
figuring this out is important.
But Harry, that's what I love about the concept of zero trust that I think Edgewise has really defined, is that identity can change, right? Because something happened, the identity of that application now has changed. That's something that's not baked into authentication largely as we know it today with multi-factor authentication.
Right. I'm not a big fan of biometrics for exactly the reasons you stated, which is it is immutable. Somebody gets my DNA, somebody gets my fingerprint. What am I going to do? Now, whereas obviously passwords and other things, those are easy to change, but they're not very secure. So you're looking for things that are secure attributes that are harder to mimic, harder to reproduce, but that can and must be able to change because things are going to fail. It's why I'm not a big fan of certificates either, because it's a single point of failure.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think that this is going to be weird, but I look at biometrics as kind of the natural gas of the IT security industry. It's a transition fuel, right, to get us to the next place.
Is it fracking? Is biometrics the fracking of the security?
Yeah.
So we're going solar?
That just came to me. It was crazy, but it's kind of like, you don't want it, but you need it for a temporary period of time. But the biggest issue is, and I take real umbrage at this, and the fact is you can't change it, right? I stick my fingerprint and it gets hashed somewhere. Once that gets leaked, I can't take back that hash, right? I mean, it's out there, and that's a serious problem. Or like in my case, not only did I get my fingerprint on my phone, then I put super glue on the end of my index finger, and I can't authenticate to my phone, right?
Right. Well, but it's really interesting too when we look at certificate attacks in the light of as I'm progressing through and coming to conclusion in the countdown to 0 day, right? And you think about just the aspect of Stuxnet to Dooku to Flame to then some of the other variants on that malware. And really, they weren't necessarily stealing certificates, right? They were stealing the trust that we had in those certificates. And that was critical to a lot of those attacks. And very interesting in this context of who and what do you trust? And
then you added a problem with like revocation lists or these devices that are out in the world and are designed to maybe be offline or in a place that they're going to be updated maybe once every 5 years, and they have a 20-year life cycle. Like revocation lists and certificate trust and trust in general then becomes a very big problem, and one that has not been solved very well, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Right. Harry?
Right. And once you have those things, the revocation lists, exactly what you said, you have to take systems that were supposed to be air gapped, and all of a sudden you have to give them connectivity. And then what trust do people piggyback on? They piggyback on that connection back to the address base. So, okay, they can now use that same channel to go back to that system that was supposed to be air gapped, that was connected solely to better its protection, and use it to further compromise the system. This is why the security industry exists and will continue to exist for as long as certainly I'm around. It's constantly dynamic, and there are new challenges, and it's not an easy problem. There's no single solution, and we're going to continue to keep finding ways to make it so that you have to eliminate the single points of failure. You've got to eliminate the non-dynamism in certain things like biometrics, and you have to move to a model that takes lots of things, multi-factor, multifaceted, different aspects into account, and constantly builds a trust score and allows things to run even under the assumption that other things right next to it might be compromised.
Yeah. And that's more true today than ever before, right? In terms of our users and our applications, they're both running in places where they're in bad neighborhoods, essentially, right? And so we have to find a way to validate and be able to trust them, even if they're in a bad neighborhood.
Yeah, not to bring it all back home to the first metaphor, but just like, and not to get political, but we have to find a way to run our country, even though there's a virus running around infecting everybody.
Yeah.
We have to figure that out. I'm not saying I have the answer. I'm just saying we have to be able to survive in a world, like virtually and real, where infection is everywhere.
Right. And we brought on Mike Lloyd, who, ironically enough, works in security today, but is also a PhD in epidemiology. And it just very succinctly stated, I mean, something we all know, right? We're balancing health and safety with this pandemic with how we run the country and how we get businesses back in business, right? And that's a balancing act that, right, wrong, or indifferent, that we're playing today. And, Mike didn't comment on, who's getting it right, who's getting it wrong kind of thing. But in his opinion, which I greatly respect given his background, is it's a balancing act. And security is the same way, right? We're balancing that usability and security. How do we protect systems that are running around with malware, and how do we protect, society today when we have a similar kind of event?
I think that's
I
one
used
of
to be
the
a
big
CISO
issues
as well
that
previously.
Go ahead, Harry.
There's a little canard with CISOs that the best way to secure a company is just, the CISO comes on board and says, okay, I'm going to unplug the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sure, we can get security if we unplug everybody's computer, but then the business stops functioning. So it is definitely a balance, and it's always been a balance to how do I plug in, how do I connect the internet again and still allow security while my company is constantly being attacked.
I think that's one of the big things that the InfoSec and even vendors in particular often get wrong is they forget that the whole point of security, and at the end of the day, we're all capitalists, is to make money. And so if we're not looking at the business aspect of this and we're not applying that security with the business in mind first and what we're doing for the business and to enable the business, which oftentimes is securing things and locking stuff down, then we're not doing our job right. And that's where people get it wrong, and they get on a high horse and get their feelings hurt because they're trying to understand why they can't just understand why we just shut all this stuff off. There are business use cases, and understanding the business is more important than the actual security most days.
Yep. You know what? Tyler just expressed completely what the Phoenix Project is all about. Right?
Yeah.
Go read that book. The Phoenix Project is exactly that. If you want to be an effective security professional, you have to understand the business. Right? And if you don't understand the business, you don't understand what you're delivering, there's no way you can be an effective security professional, because you're getting paid because the business is producing widgets or whatever it does,
Yeah, and I think that, to relate that to some of the things we're discussing today with respect to the pandemic, how are we supposed to eat and drink in a restaurant when we're wearing a mask, right? And how many times in our security career have we come to those choices where, we've been like, no, you have to do this. And, the business is like, well, how are we supposed to eat and drink if we're wearing a mask? Like, hold on. Everyone needs to back up now.
Eating or drinking, how do you smoke a cigar wearing a mask?
This is true, Jeff. Yes.
Well, I just to make you feel a little bit better, I don't know what the stats are, but I am told that actually smoking is less represented in the infection rate than in the general population. So I think maybe smoking a cigar should be a good thing every now and then. I'm not saying it's a healthy thing, but I'm not saying it's not a healthy
I've always said that, Harry. I've always said that. It's a good thing. I think one thing it does
Okay.
is keep sick people away. I've always said that,
I
right?
think we
Yeah.
need the,
It does do
lawyer's
that.
disclaimer. I think we need the legal disclaimer to be read out right now. So
Yes, exactly. You have to
Put
be
it right under
of
there.
legal smoking and drinking age in not just your state, city, but county as well, and you should do so responsibly.
and don't do it because smoking
I am
causes
not the Surgeon
irreparable harm
General.
to your health.
Right. Jeff, final questions, closing thoughts?
A final question, and it's random and without context, but Harry, I want your raw response to this silly question. The traditional forms of authentication being something that you have, something that you are, something that you know. Do you believe that any one of those is inherently more secure than any of the other? Can you rank them, or are they all equally good, bad, or indifferent?
I think you rank them. My gut has always been, and this is sort of the way I approach multiple factors, is you rank them based on the criteria we've discussed here. How easy is it for it to be forged? So something you know, how easy is it for somebody to get a hold of that? Something you are, how easy is it to be forged? For example, your signature, your fingerprint, some place you are. How easy is it to forge GPS coordinates or other things? Obviously, I think there are some things that are more easily spoofed than other things, or more easily guessed. Something you know is one of those typical things, simply because the brain is what it is, that I don't put a lot of stock in. So I would value, I guess it's a long answer, but the short answer is I value each of those on different axes. I don't give them the same scale and say, okay, well, one's a 10, one's a 3. It's on the axes of spoofability, reproducibility, dynamism. Something you are is a lot harder to change if it needs to. So I can't tell you that I come down on any one of them, but I can tell you certainly, I am not a big fan of something that's definitely not my top pick if I had to pick one.
Okay, so that's 3. What's 2? And what's 1? We won't hold you to it, but go ahead and rank them.
Well, so it's something you have and something you are.
Mm-hmm.
I think something you are is more secure, but I don't like it for its dynamism. Something you have. I'm actually a big fan of some place you are. I think that because it's something you have and it's somewhere you have. I'm a big fan of taking something like a mobile device and tying that in with its GPS locations to something else, to some other device you're trying to authenticate on. Because I think that's now something you have as well as some place you are. It's a lot harder to forge. It's easy to fix if you have a bad phone or you have something there. There's some other issue that you need to change, or you're, for example, moving. So let's say you're allowed to access while you're in New York, but you're moving to California. You can update those kinds of rules. I think I'm a big fan of that. I don't know if I'd list that as my number one, but it would probably be up there as number one. And then below that would have been something you are, just because I happen to hate biometrics for reasons we've discussed already.
So Harry, that's an interesting response, Harry, because I think in our transition, as we jump over biometrics, transition fuel, we're going to end up with some combination, I believe, of temporal
Tracking
and geographic component.
It's a combination.
I think you kind of nailed it on that, right? Temporal, multi-factor is really temporal, and you think about it, and geographic is something that a lot of folks are starting to dabble in. So, yeah.
It's awesome stuff.
Yeah.
Harry, I want to thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly. I just absolutely loved the discussion. It got my brain churning and my gears spinning. So thank you very much for that. And, of course, to all of our hosts participating in the conversation. It was just fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being on here, and I hope to be back soon.
Absolutely. Listeners that want to learn more about the Edgewise solution can go to securityweekly.com/Edgewise. By all means, go check it out, as it can help you with the security of your applications and ties into so many things we talked about in this segment. So with that, we'll take a short break, come back, talk about the security news for this week. Stay tuned.